Hello and welcome to Supercharge or Mox. I'm Bill Hatfield, and this is a Geico Cloud Academy luncheon, part of the Lunch and Learn series. And I am going to talk to you today about mocking, specifically mocking with MOQ, the mocking software that we use here. I'll begin by just doing a brief refresher of mocking. And then I'll talk about how mock works, what commands that it offers, and what commands you'll need to use most often so that you don't have to wade through tons of documentation. Finally, I'll wrap up with some examples using mock. So, what's a mock? When you test a method, you need to focus in on that method. You don't want to testing things that go beyond the method. A method may call a class or an object that's outside of itself, and you don't want to test those other things. But the function needs that other thing in order to work. So a solution to doing this is to give it a fake thing to use, a fake resource that returns nothing but hard-coded values so that you can then in your test use those hard-coded values and then evaluate what the function should do based on those values. So in this way, you cut out the resource and instead replace it with something that will just do what you want it to do. So let's take a look at how this works. In production, you may have a travel class. Now this travel class calls an API method called getDistance, and it's calculate travel time from ND2. So in the production code on the left, you'll see that a new Google Maps API object is created. And when travel is instantiated, that Maps API is passed to travel. As you can see on the right, the travel class has a travel constructor which accepts the Maps API and assigns it to an internal variable. Then the calculate travel time to and from Indy uses that variable when it calls the method. So basically, this is what's referred to as injection. It basically means that your object, your method here, is going to need access to this resource. So when we instantiate the class, we also pass in the resource, and then it just uses what we passed in. Then it can call the calculate travel time to Indy. This is how it works in production, and all of that works just fine. But what if you're testing? You really want to be able to do unit tests that allow you to test just the code in calculate travel time from ND2 without having to worry about this Maps API. So how can you do that? For production, you're passing this directly in the real one, but for testing, it's different. Instead of creating an instance of the real Maps API, you instantiate a mock. Now, mock here, M-O-C-K, is a class in the mock MOQ framework. And this allows you to create a new object based on an interface. So you'll notice that the Google Maps API inherits from, or in this case, implements IMAP with a getDistance method in it. So the mock then implements the IMAP interface as well. So it also has a getDistance method. Now we can pass this mock to travel to the class when we instantiate it instead of the Google Maps API, which is done in production. Then we can make a call to calculate travel time from ND2, and it will use that mock when it calls the getDistance function. So basically, a mock is a replacement for a resource that's outside of your test method, something that it needs in order to function, but can be replaced so that we can control the data that it gets. So how do you do this? How do you make this magic work? Well, Mock, MOQ, is a framework specifically designed for creating mocks, and then identifying how they should behave, and then determining if if the methods have been called that you expect are called. So let's dive into that and take a look. First thing you need to do is to create a mock object, and that begins with an interface. You need an interface that's implemented by the real resource and by the mock resource. So in this case, there's an interface called IMAP service. Now in .NET, you can't instantiate an interface, right? An interface just describes the methods that are available, and a given class will then implement that interface, and then it will have to provide implementations for all of those methods. But with mocks, you actually can, in a way, instantiate an interface. What it does is it takes that interface and creates a new mock object which implements that interface. Now, in this case, we've created the object and put the object in map mock. Now, the instantiation of mock IMAP interface creates a mock object, an object from the mock framework. The instantiation of the IMAP service, the thing which will act as the stand-in for the map service, is actually in a property of map mock. As you can see here, that property is named object. So when you instantiate travel, then you're passing that instance of IMAP service. How do you set up your mock methods? In a mock, you can set up a method so that it behaves in a particular way. So here we've got mapmock.setup, and then we've got a lambda expression. The lambda expression is basically just to allow us to identify a method that will get called when the application runs. When the unit test runs, it's going to call this method. Now, what we're saying here is if the getDistance method is called with precisely these numbers, 40.234 and 87.232, then you should return 30.5. So this allows us to set up hard-coded return values for a particular method. That way, we can allow the code we're testing to receive back that value, and then it can process it, and we can measure the results to see if the code we are testing is doing what it's supposed to do. In the code on the bottom, you'll see another way of doing this. If you want to specify the data that should be coming in, you can do that, or if you don't care about the data coming in, you can just use this strange syntax where it says it is any and then specifies a data type. So it is any double, it is any double. So both of those arguments can accept a double of any value, and then it will return the 30.5. Sometimes you want to return an object, not just a simple value. So in this code, you'll see that getCurrentWeather, when a 1 is passed to it, it will, this setup tells it to return a new current weather object, and then all these properties are set. This will cause system we're testing to get this data back and work with it, and then we can see if it's doing what it's supposed to do with it. The syntax is really pretty much just what you'd expect, and you don't have to specify all the properties in there, just specify the ones that you want. I've shown you how you can return a simple value and how you can return an object from a method. Now, sometimes you want a method of a mocked object to return an exception. Sometimes if you call this method and you pass it a certain parameter, it doesn't like that and it throws an argument exception. You don't care about what causes that exception to occur, but you do care about how your method that you're testing handles that exception. In this case, we're saying mapmock has a get distance, it accepts a couple of doubles, and here in this particular test, we want it to throw a new argument exception. That way we can see how it handles that situation. Another method that you can use with setup, in addition to returns and throws, is callback. Callback allows you to specify code which is executed when that method is called. So in this case, when do something is called, it's actually going to increment calls, and then it's going to return true. So that's a simple test and a way that you can check the number of calls, because every time it's called, that variable is going to be incremented.
Yeah. So let's look at this. So we create a list of strings. We have a do something method that accepts any string. The callback here takes the string that we passed and adds it to that list. Okay? So if this do something ends up during your run getting called 3 or 4 times, that call args will have all of the arguments set for those 3 or 4 times. So we're going to do these setups to indicate what these methods should do. Where in our unit test do we do that? Arrange, act, assert. Arrange is correct. Why? You're telling the mock how to behave. You want to do that before you actually do the act, right? So that will be in the arrange. That is different than verify. Verify will always be where? In your assert. Because what are you doing? You're specifying, I want to know if it was called once. And in this case, you're specifying values. So I want to know, was this method called with these 2 values once? Okay? If it wasn't called, if it was called with some other values, or if it was called with those values twice, all will fail. Okay? Only if it's called with those values once will it work. Now, here's the cool thing. This times has all of these properties. So you can say times at most 7. And as long as it's been 7 or less, then it will pass the test.
Like this would have failed. How specific would be like the method you would get? Like if it like that, if it was called once but with different parameters, for example, how clear is it going to be?
It's not going to be terribly clear. I think you can put a comma here and put a message if you want to clarify that, and that'll appear in the test window. Almost all the asserts have that, and I think this does too. So with all of those options, you can see that this gives you a lot of flexibility. How often should you use verify? You should use it in pretty much all of the tests that use mock. Because what are you doing? Why do you care whether this was called or that was called? Is that part of the system under test? Yes, because the method you're testing is doing those calls, right? Or it's not, and you want to know, right?
I think every test should include that, or you saying like if you
No,
like
every test that uses a mock should have verified, typically.
okay, so like what if? Because I don't want to do like redundant testing either. Like so, what if you're like for some reason like if it get in like a get distance, whatever reason is calling it.
Yeah, I mean,
like.
as long as you're testing, as you're verifying exactly the same thing, okay, then you could not do it a second time.
But there should absolutely be a testing, verify this method was called, and tell me what
Right.
in your.
Yes.
Quick question about method determination for that. What happens when the arguments or parameters are in some sort of inheritance hierarchy?
These are in some sort of inheritance hierarchy, yes.
What happens if there's some masking in that situation? Does mock go to like parents, go to that specific method? Does it work up?
Works exactly the same way as polymorphism always does.
Okay.
Yep. No weirdness there. All right, so let's jump in to being now privacy. All right, got half an hour. So let's jump into Ging now and take a look at the program UI tests. Let me make this a little bigger. How's that? Can you all see that? Okay. So here's something I want to show you. When you're testing, this is not mock related necessarily, but it is involved. You can do this test initialize and have a setup method. Okay? When does that get executed? Does it get executed when this class is first instantiated?
Before each test is run.
Good. It's not just when it's instantiated, but each of these tests runs as a separate method. This always runs first, and then the method. And then this runs first, and then the method. You with me? Okay. So this doesn't happen once. It happens every time a method is called in here. So it's kind of handy, right? In this case, we've got output string set to null because we've got output string up here. Output string is going to be, you know, whatever was gathered in the user interface. And we've also got a mock console and a mock search engine. One of the first things I do on your tests is to check to see if you've mocked the right thing, okay? In this case, I would be looking to see, is there a mock made for the search engine? Also, is real search engine ever mentioned in this file, okay? Because you can create a mock and use the mock sometimes and then use the search engine sometimes. I've seen that done. That's not what you're doing, right? You are mocking out the search engine altogether. Okay? And what we're testing then is the user interface, nothing else. So let's take a look at this method. So the method is called addLink. When adding a non-sponsored link, should call search engine add with the link. Okay? So expected URL, description, category is a string and category is the actual thing. Setup console here is going to, wait a minute, one more thing I want to point out. The search engine mock is created here, right? So every method has a search engine mock that it can use straight away, okay? So you don't have to instantiate it again and again in each one of these. So what this does, it doesn't do any setup for the mock search engine. No setups, okay? It does set up the console. This is just a method that takes the, array of elements and gives those to the user interface.
What do you mean it doesn't do any setup for the mock?
There are no setup methods in here that say, mock controller dot setup and this method returns this.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Okay. We run it with this input. Okay? So basically add a link. Then down here, I say mock search engine verify. Notice I'm verifying something I never set up to begin with. Is that legal? The answer is yes. When you create a mock object, you can specify whether that object should be considered strict or not. Okay? If you don't, which is the default, then it will accept any sort of method call you give to it and return whatever is accepted, like a default value for whatever's expected back. So this is kind of loosey-goosey, right? If you say strict, then only the methods you set up and exactly the way you set up will be responded to, and anything else will get you an error as if you called a method on an object that didn't exist. Okay? So, but since we're going loosey-goosey here, which I think most people do, we say search engine verify, and add is the thing that we want to check, and we want to say add, it is non-sponsored link. So what we're checking is was a non-sponsored link sent to add. Okay? And not only that, but we want to check to see that that non-sponsored link has these property values set to these exact things. Okay? And we want to make sure all of that happened just like that once. So this is nice because it allows to verify several things at once, right? First, and most basic, we're saying, did this method get called? Okay? But second, we're saying it needs to have gotten called with something of this data type. And third, the thing of that data type should have all of these properties set exactly as I described. Only then will this pass, otherwise it'll fail. Make sense? Questions on that? Okay. That guy up. Here. All right, so this method is called financials. When links are returned from search engine get financials, should show links. So when links are returned, it should show them, right? And this is for financials. All right, so what are we going to set up? Obviously, we're going to set up get financials because that's what's going to be called in the user interface. Now here we do a rather detailed setup of get financials. We say get financials should be called with the number 5. Now in this implementation, get financials accepts a number and then it only returns that many rows. Okay, so you may remember that Ging required only display at 5 rows. So this actually makes it more flexible in that you could send other values, but for the user interface, for this application, it really is only supposed to pass 5. So we verified that it was called and it passed 5. And when that happens, we want this to be returned. So I've shown you where you can instantiate an object here, and this is just an extension of the same idea. I'm creating a new, what am I creating here? It seems distinctly like there's a data type missing. Right? What am I doing? What's that? I'm doing an array of sponsored links, but I don't say new sponsored link here, which is what you might expect. The answer is I don't have to. I just use this to indicate an array, and then it looks at the data inside and surmises the type. And that's really smart.
So what is going on in your, like, where it says max length, like stuff highlighted in gray?
Oh.
Kind of like...
This is something I have set up. How many of you see these things? Okay. This is, oh, you see them too? No, I mean, do you see them in your own visuals? Right there. Who's fine? Who sees it in your own Visual Studio? Okay. This is a setting in ReSharper, and when you turn it on, it just tells you the name of what each of the things are. And this is nice if you have something that has more than a couple of parameters, or even sometimes with a couple of parameters, what is it that this thing is? Rather than, oh, you've got to remember the first thing you said is this, the second thing is. I actually kind of like it. I don't necessarily like the way it screws up formatting as I look at it. But by the way, these are not real. If someone else pulls up this code and they don't have that setting, they won't see these. Okay? They're just inserted by the editor. So, returns a new array of sponsored links with this link and that link. That cool? All right. Then we tell the console when they ask for input, send financials. And then I'm not doing any checks for the call to get financials, but which I could do here, right? I could say verify that get financials was called with 5 or whatever. But I'm kind of indirectly doing it because I'm saying these things are returned, and then I check the output string to see if the URL for each of these is in the output string.
Like in this example, so you're using mocks, you get into is that verifiable, you get into is verified no, sir. Like you're still checking stuff in there, but you didn't like explicitly.
Right.
Okay.
And if I had, it wouldn't be bad.
Right.
Just in this case, I didn't feel like it was quite necessary. You'll use your own judgment on lots of these things. And sometimes there's more than one right answer, so don't get too hung up. All right. Here's just another example. In this case, the check is when no links are returned from search engine get financials, should show message. By the way, sometimes people name these and say should throw, argument exception or something like that. Well, you're not testing to see if it throws an argument exception, right? You're testing to see if a message was displayed. So make sure that I said this before, that the should always corresponds directly to the code in the assert, okay? Always, directly, okay? And then, of course, the when corresponds to, your setup, right? All right, so what's happening here? Somebody tell me what's happening here. That's true. That's true.
So when you're passing in, when the search engine is called, or get financial is called on the search engine, or
Mhm.
money in, then it will return a new list of links.
Which is empty,
Correct.
right? So that's generally what Get Financials does. It returns either an empty list or a list with something in it. So in this case, we're saying do that, call financials, and then just check the output to make sure it says what it's supposed to. That's all. These examples help? Questions? This code will be available out there. By the way, I apologize for not getting stuff out there for the last presentation, but I'm going to try to get both presentations out there by the end of today or first thing tomorrow. Okay. I had some trouble with the recording. All right. Now, back here, I want to switch now, and I want to talk about a couple of common mocking mistakes that I see in the L2, and kind of address them. They seem to, both sort of correspond to the idea that the person writing it doesn't quite get what a mock is supposed to be. So let me show you those and see what you think. This is going to be kind of a what's wrong with this picture kind of thing. All right, so this is called search. When links are returned from the search engine search, should be shown. Okay? Take a look at the code. So somebody walk us through it. What is this code doing?
You're doing two words. You set up the mock, but then you're also setting up the console with the base.
Good. So
already putting it in the mock. We don't need to add all the stuff implicitly in the console.
exactly. So what we're doing here is we're setting up the search method so that it always, when it gets main, it always returns these two links, right? And then in this console, we're adding a link, which exactly corresponds to that one. And we're adding another link, which exactly corresponds to that one. And then we do a search with main and check the result, right? We're checking the output string for the two URLs. Now that works and that passes, but that's not right. It seems to imply that the person doesn't quite understand what a mock does. It's not using the real one. just using your fake one. Your fake one's not doing any work, and you're not trying to recreate the one out there with the fake one, right? You're just trying to stub it out. So these do absolutely nothing, right? Have we set up what's supposed to happen when they click add? Have we set up the add method? No. So when it gets this, it's just going to roll right off its back. It has no effect at all. So all you have to do is set this up and do search. Does that make sense? Questions? All right, one more. All right, so this is when searching with an empty string should show message. Okay? So nothing crazy here. We're saying when they search with an empty string, it should throw argument exception with the text search cannot be blank. We do search. We run it, and then we check to see if the output contains that error message. Does that look okay? Not trying to trick you here. Or am I? That's fine. Yeah.
Well, like you said before, if you're throwing, you're not showing message. They just throw message.
Should show message.
If you're trying to show message, then you're not throwing. You should say should throw.
No. What we're doing is we're telling the search engine to throw.
You're not showing it, but you're saying that it's.
But we're testing to see if this message is displayed. It throws it, it's caught by the user interface, and then it displays the message. So the assert is checking to see that the message was displayed. The setup is causing the exception to be thrown, right?
Do we want it? We are actually wanting it to display the message, not throw an exception. Or,
We don't want, there's no try-catch in here, right?
Right.
So the program UI, the user interface, is not throwing an exception.
Okay.
And that's the code we're
part's
testing.
correct. So that's not what you're.
Right.
Okay.
The resource is throwing an exception. We want to see how the program UI handles that
Okay.
by displaying that message.
We created a mock console and the mock search. We're on .NET. And we created this, yeah.
What, the mock search engine?
Right.
Yeah, we created that at the setup, so it gets created every time. So this is okay, okay? Now, let me show you another method that's right here after it. Search. When search text is less than 3 characters long, should show message, right? There's not much point in searching on AB. So what we're doing here then is saying setup, search, throws argument exception, search requires 3 or more characters. We do a search with AA, and then we check to see if that error message is there.
Is any string is any length though, right?
What's that?
It is any string that's any length, so.
Right. Right.
There'll be, this is a search engine functionality.
Again, we're not trying to recreate what the resource actually does. We're not trying to recreate functionality that says, is it less than 3? If so, throw the exception. What we're trying to test is the user interface and say, if that exception is thrown, does it display the message? You with me?
So mock you're saying any string is going to throw, then it's going to throw, and that's all we needed to do in this instance. Come on. So that's why that, right? That's why any string wants to.
That's actually the confusion I'm getting at here too. We've got 2 methods here that really, they seem to be exercising 2 different bits of functionality. But those different bits of functionality are not in the system we're testing. Those 2 bits of functionality are in the search engine which we're trying to mock. The user interface needs to know this. If I get an argument exception, whatever message is in that argument exception gets displayed. You with me?
Yes.
So these two tests are redundant. Even though there are two different conditions that could cause that to happen, the user interface doesn't distinguish between those. It receives the argument exception and displays the error. So essentially, these two things are doing the same thing. What you'd want to do instead is to say, program UI search when argument exception is thrown from search engine should show message. That would cover all of them.
And then the actual.
Well, both of these, yes.
Right, and then, but your actual, the number and all that stuff, that would be done when you're testing the search engine.
Yes, you'll have a separate test for the search engine. So do not, people make this mistake all the time. If you're testing the same functionality in two different places, then that means you're doing extra tests. You're probably testing beyond where you're supposed to on one.
Because what the message contains, because the two messages are different, it's irrelevant.
That's right.
And that's why.
The only thing you care about is that whatever is here is also here.
But that would be, the second test would be correct if this was like, say, a network application, or like, we don't want to hit the server with requests that don't have enough information on them. Like, we want to make sure we don't send a request that says S3 or fewer than 3 characters in it. That might be.
Well, right, but that would be in the unit test for the search engine. This is a unit test for the user interface.
I'm saying if the user interface was a different application that communicated with, like, over the internet.
Yeah.
So that
You
would.
just- Yeah, you just need to, all I'm saying is, test the thing you're testing, don't test anything
Yeah,
else.
if that was a requirement of our UI, then we would
Yes.
test it. That's a search engine.
Does that make sense? All right. Those are the two things I wanted to show you. I just want to make clear what the mock is. It is not a replacement for the real object. You're not trying to re-implement the real object as a mock. All you're trying to do is say, when they call that, I want it to do this functionality. I want it to do this code. I want it to return this value. I want it to throw this exception. The only reason you're doing that is so that you can tell if the system under test responds to that in the way you expect it to. Does that make sense? That's all I got. Any questions overall?
What is Shiv's take on mock?
Shiv's take on mock is this. First of all, you don't use mocks in the same way. He has a test double idea. You've all been through this. So he has a test double. You only ever do it when on the edges of your system, where you're going out to a service or database or whatever it is. If you're going outside your system, that's when you mock that resource and mock. And his approach is to say, service locator, here, if you need this service, do this, call this thing. Need this service, do this thing. So that's called the service locator. And you pass that in, and it goes all the way down the line, wherever it's needed. And then when it needs to call a service, it looks it up and calls back. At the very beginning, you either put the real services in there or you put the fake services in there. It's a system that works. My opinion is that it's a bit overcomplicated, and I also have the opinion that mocking at these other levels is helpful because it helps you zero in on exactly what you're doing. Now, there's two kinds of tests that are run with the same automated test suite, right? There are also integration tests that don't test one unit. By the way, one unit or unit test means one class, and very often one method. So if you're testing across multiple objects in your unit tests, then that's an integration test, and that's totally fine. But when you're testing a unit, then you've got to have some way to say, don't use that other class here, don't use that other class, because I just want to test you. And so I think mocks actually reduce the amount of code that you have to do or you feel like you should do, because you keep getting this broader picture and you come up with more ideas of things that you should be testing, but usually you've overreached your bounds. Right? So if you use a mock, it helps to ensure that it's just this thing here. Yeah.
I have a question about like multiple search for a single test. So like it's like for that one example that you did, it was like returning a specific object, and you're making sure that it returns a specific object or something. How, when you are naming that test, how, like how, I didn't notice when you did the example, but how specific would you recommend being? Like, so your unit testing isn't obnoxiously long, but it's also clear that you are looking for those specific parameters or something like that. Like, how many verifications? Like when you did your unit test.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this once before, and it's just a balancing act, right? If you want to say it's past this object and this integer and this thing and so forth, maybe you don't want to put all of that in the when part of your name, but you do want to try to be specific. So it's just balance. You have to find out what balance is. But you can see that based on what I was showing you there, I'm not shy about letting them get wrong. It's just there is a point of absurdity.
Kind of along the same lines, but like if you're doing a verify method is called and it returns something specific. Like even though there are two different verifications, you don't necessarily have to have a test that's just verifying or a test that's just right. Like that's
a good question. So every function should do in normal coding, not test coding, but in normal coding, every function should do one thing, right? Tests are the same way. It should test one thing. Now, one thing is more often than not, it falls out and makes sense. But in tests, there are going to be times when you're like, well, I'm asserting this and I'm asserting this, and technically it's kind of two different things, but they're really all the same setup and everything. And it might be okay to just take them apart. It might be okay to leave them together. Just use your best judgment. That's all I can say, because those things exist. But err on the side of, if you've got, a couple dozen asserts in there, you may want to check to see if you're testing for really more than one thing. By the way, another key thing is don't test. I mentioned a couple of these last week. Don't test for. Don't do asserts on things just because you know they should be true at that point. Only assert things that you're specifically trying to verify with this test. Okay? So, yeah. Questions? Concerns? Numbers? Qualifications?
One concern experience I had, like when you when you want to test object B, which depends on object A, you create a mark of object A and use that in your test for B, right? Let's say object A changed. They updated the unit test for the object A, but they never changed the mark that is used in the mark B, test B. Then there is a problem.
Could be, absolutely. Yeah. But that should show up. The test should fail. Maybe it wouldn't. That's true.
Yeah, I had to clean up a lot of unit tests in Sage project.
That's a good point. Yeah. I hadn't even thought that through, but that's a really good point.
You're saying if the bot no longer behaves like the original, it won't fail because it's
It
not.
will still become original, not modified.
Now again, remember, you've got an interface that should be implemented by both, right?
So if the interface changed, it would break. But let's say for some reason it was something really specific. Did it change?
If it starts throwing an exception where it didn't throw an exception before, for example, interface is the same, but now you're testing for the wrong kind of functionality, and the mock you're setting up yourself, right? So you don't know that the code has changed in the real thing. So yeah, there's some subtleties there that I guess wouldn't be flagged, wouldn't notice. Yeah, just because you got a test that passes doesn't mean it represents anything about reality. Questions? Anything else? That's good. Thank you for that. Oh, here's the thing. We don't get enough people responding to the surveys, right?
What surveys?
The surveys.
We don't
So,
do surveys.
We got 80% of them.
yeah, on that survey. On these surveys for the lunch and learn, not so much. Please do the survey for this. He's going to try not to spam you because it has been observed that perhaps he's sending out too many emails related to this stuff, especially on Splunk and all that. So he's going to try to do that less. But what I need you to do is to go back to your calendar appointment, and there's a link in there now that you can take you directly to the survey for this. We really appreciate it. Give us good, honest feedback, and I want to just keep making all these things better for us. Questions?
Thank you.
Yes.
Specific race question again to test on right now. I have